My pleasure now to introduce the next session on the agenda, which focuses on climate change and the role media needs to play if we are to avert the dangerous global warming. As Christiana Figueres, Secretary General of the UNFCCC at the time the Paris Agreement was reached, so eloquently put in her forewords to our recent report called The Power of Media, the media sector, in all its glorious forms and formats, has a proud history of tackling society's darkest moments head-on. Slavery, suffrage, and civil rights, just to name a few. What if we could use the inherent cultural power of media content to solve the defining challenge of our time? We're currently witnessing a gap between current efforts and actual requirements, between our greenhouse gas emissions and the planet's tolerance for those emissions. Politicians and climate scientists alike refer to this as the emissions gap. I prefer to think of it as a culture gap. A gap between what we are doing and what is possible and in fact necessary on the other. No industry is better positioned to close this gap than the media sector. Inspired by Christiana's words and the increasing collaboration we saw in other sectors such as fashion, we developed and launched the Media Climate Pact on the 9th of November in 2020 when COP26 should have started if COVID hadn't come around the corner. It's a dual pledge. Signatories commit to reduce their own emissions to net zero through science-based targets and to help drive behavior change towards climate-friendly lifestyles through content. This dual strategy is still what needs to happen today for media to make its unique contribution to tackling climate change. We are honored to be joined by three experts in the field of climate who will be inspiring us on how we can create more and better content to tackle the climate crisis. They will have 30 minutes each for a presentation followed by a Q&A. So, live audience, please make a mental note of any questions that come to you, and online audience, please use the submit question button on the bottom of your screen. Our first speaker is Bill McKibben. Bill's 1989 book, The End of Nature, is regarded as the first book for a general audience about climate change and has appeared in 24 languages. When I started studying climate change, much later, in the early 2010s, Bill's work was still a core piece of that curriculum, so he's something of a personal hero. Bill has written many more books, including his most recent, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? His work appears regularly in periodicals from The New Yorker to Rolling Stone, and his recent New Yorker article called When Creatives Turn Destructive, Image Makers and the Climate Crisis called out the intellectual significance of media agencies in the climate fight. Bill helped found 350.org, the first global grassroots campaign, and has played a leading role in launching opposition to the big oil pipeline projects and fossil fuel divestment. Today, he is the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. He was a 2014 recipient of the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, and the Gandhi Peace Award. Bill will speak about how media should drive action in the state of climate emergency that we find ourselves in. Bill, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's a tremendous pleasure to get to join you, if only from a distance, and a real pleasure to get to share this hour with Genevieve Gunther, too, who you'll be hearing from in a little while and is bringing remarkable insight to these discussions. So let me begin by saying that I think it's possible, probably likely, that I've written more words about climate change in the English language than anybody else over the last 30-some years, for more periodicals and more places and more time. So these are questions that are far from theoretical to me. And I'll also begin by saying that I admired the spirited introduction about the role that media has played in the past with the great crises that the world has faced, but I'm not completely sure that that historians would agree about the degree to which media has always acted responsibly in these crises. It's funny. I was just doing some reporting for a book that I'm at work on the history of slavery, and was amazed to find the degree to which in my country, advertisements for slaves provided a huge percentage of the income for one periodical after another, decade after decade after decade. And that's probably a good reminder of how easy it is for us to fall into the idea that business as usual is okay when we face these moments of actual existential crisis. And that's where I'm going to begin and just talk for a minute about the actual scale of the crisis that we're facing, in order to remind people that that though in media we deal with an endless series of important issues, there's no other issue in human experience that's risen to quite the existential level of the one that we face right now. Um, Climate change is by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done. It's not another item on a list of problems to be ticked off. In fact, it's probably better viewed as a kind of lens through which to examine at this point the rest of the world. And when you begin that examination, the first and last thing you're reminded is that climate change is the single most unjust thing that human beings have ever figured out how to do. Its victims are first and foremost those who have done the least to cause it. So let's bear in mind that we're talking about things that are existential for our civilizations as a whole, and that hit hardest at those who have the least influence in the conduct of those civilizations. Just to bring people quickly up to date on where we are as we head into COP26, human beings have raised the temperature of the Earth about 1 degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like an enormous amount, but it turns out that it is. If you think about it in other units, you might have a better sense of what's going on. Every day, the extra heat that we trap near the planet, because of the carbon that we've put into the atmosphere, is the heat equivalent of about 500,000 Hiroshima-sized explosions. Thought about that way, it gets easier to understand how we've melted most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic, why it is that the jet stream and the Gulf Stream are no longer operating in the ways they have throughout human history. It gets easier to understand how we've managed to discombobulate the hydrological cycle of the Earth, the way that water moves around the planet. You saw, well, in arid areas, that means we get more evaporation, more drought. If you wanted one fact to understand our century, you could do worse than warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That's why we get these extreme wildfires now in arid and hot areas of the planet. But once that water is evaporated up into the atmosphere, it comes down, and it comes down in downpours and floods like we've never seen. Yesterday, we had in Italy the single biggest rainfall event in recorded European history. I was in New York City a month ago today when we had the biggest rainfall event in New York City in its 150 years of measuring such things. That rainfall smashed the record that had been set 11 days earlier. People drowned in their basements. So the point is both obvious and also so big that it eludes our grasp some of the time. We're rewriting the rules on planet Earth right now. And the planet that we're used to thinking about is no longer the planet that we live on. It's as if we'd taken a journey to a planet with a different physics than the one that we originally inhabited. And we're continuing to take that journey. We're obviously not going to stop global warming at this point. That's no longer on the menu. But the choice now is between a planet where the temperature goes up 3 degrees Celsius or more. And if that happens, then I think by this point, it's pretty clear that we're not going to have civilizations like the ones we're used to having. If nothing else, the UN High Commission on Refugees sets an upper bound for about 1 billion climate refugees this century. Try to imagine what that world looks like. You know, 1 million refugees coming from Syria was enough to discombobulate the politics of Europe. A million refugees from Central America was enough to turn American politics upside down. Now increase those numbers by 1,000 and try to figure out what it looks like. In economic terms, the high-end estimates for unchecked global warming for economic damage are about $551 trillion by the end of the century, which is more money than currently exists on planet Earth. Again, just understand that the scale of what we're dealing with makes it utterly different from anything else we've ever dealt with. This is the final exam for human beings, where we find out whether our civilizations are useful for long-term survival or not. And one of the important questions about that is whether our media systems are capable. I mean, to use the analogy, they're kind of the central nervous system for our body politic. And so far, they have not covered themselves in glory when it comes to dealing with climate change. For the first 20 or 25 years of this crisis, they did a terrible job. Most of the reporting was a kind of he said, she said account of climate science. And as we now understand it, that was a completely rigged game. Great reporting from a few sources: Inside Climate News, the Pulitzer Prize winning website, the LA Times, the Columbia Journalism School, over the last 5 years made it very clear that the fossil fuel industry had known everything there was to know about global warming back in the 1980s. And they just chose to lie about it. They went and hired the same people that had worked for the tobacco industry once upon a time. Those guys rolled out a massive and expensive disinformation campaign. And for 25 years, the world's media more or less bought it and played along. We're gold in what's the biggest, most consequential lie in human history, because it cost us the one thing we don't have any of: time. We wasted almost 3 decades. Now, reporting around these issues over the last 5 years has gotten much better. That's especially true in elite media. If you, say in the US, read the Times and the Post every day, or in the UK, if you were reading the Guardian regularly or things, you'd have a good understanding of what was going on with climate change. And that's useful, at least to a point in where we are. It doesn't take into account that broadcast media continues to do a poor job here in helping people understand, especially just in the volume of its coverage. One is always amazed to read these studies that people manage to put together year after year that show that the TV news networks have devoted, in the course of a year, they've devoted 9 minutes or 14 minutes or 22 minutes or something to covering climate change, that when you compare it to the amount of attention they've lavished on the Kardashians or, other somewhat less crucial phenomenon, it comes up short. So that's part of the problem. We are beginning to get a little better in at least describing the phenomenon that endangers us. Partly that's because Mother Nature has done a good job of reporting for us. Past a certain point, if you're looking out the window every day and the sky is filled with smoke, who are you going to believe? Fox News or your own lying eyes? And partly it's because activists have built huge movements that finally have managed to get in people's faces and begin to drive some of the coverage. And it's taken a long time to get there. And I could tell stories for a long time about what the early days of those movements looks like and how difficult it was to get coverage of any kind. But it is very good to see that, say, journalists have recognized the moral power and authority of figures like Greta Thunberg, and begun finally to pay them some heed and attention. The problem now boils down to the fact that, having wasted 30 years, we have to move with extraordinary speed. The world scientists have given us more or less a deadline. The IPCC told us in 2018 that if we had not cut emissions in half by 2030, then the chance of hitting the targets we set in Paris just 6 years ago would go by the board. They would be nil. I'll point out that 2030 is now 8 years and change away. That doesn't give us much time. And it doesn't give us any time for what's emerging as the kind of first round of responses from corporate and political elites. And that first round of responses, 30 years into this crisis, is a long set of fairly pathetic attempts to postpone reckoning. That's why you see, this round of companies and politicians pledging that they will go something called net zero by 2050. So the first thing to be said is 2050 is not really an interesting target here. It's, 3 CEOs or 7 prime ministers or whatever away. It's not an accountable number, and it's not a scientifically interesting one either, because we need to do most of what we're going to do, or an awful lot of it, over the next 8 years, or else we're not going to be, they're not going to be, 2050 will be, we will have lost the leverage that we need in order to materially affect how high the temperature eventually goes. The second thing to be said about these, targets and protestations and policies that we're seeing now is that they generally represent very little. This concept of net zero is coming to cover a wide multitude of sins, and people are not asking good, sharp questions about it. Just to give the kind of examples that that give you some sense of that, the EU has gone in big in the last couple of years for burning vast quantities of wood in an effort to produce electricity in what they describe as a carbon neutral form. But there isn't a scientist left who thinks that there's anything carbon neutral about it. In fact, the numbers show that, that big Drax plant down in the UK is probably producing, doing more damage to the climate than if it was burning coal. And yet, this is the kind of stuff, these kind, or fictional tree planting campaigns, or on and on and on, that all of which get us away from the crux of the matter. And the crux of the matter is, we have to stop as soon as is, sooner than is convenient in any way, burning anything on this planet. We've got to stop burning coal, gas, oil, wood, whatever else. And we have to rely on the fact that the good Lord put a large burning ball of flame 93 million miles away, and we now know how to make good use of it. We have solar panels and we have wind turbines to count for the differential heating of the sun that drives the winds. And the great news, and this is really a hugely important story that hasn't quite been explained in the dimensions that it should, is that the engineers have provided us over the last decade with that particular miracle. They've dropped the cost of renewable energy 90%. It's now the cheapest way of generating power on Earth. Not many people really know that at this point, because, among other things, the kind of lazy habits of journalism uh, lag behind the reality. And so the kind of notion is still abroad that this is somehow odd or expensive or power that isn't particularly useful. But at this point, nothing could be further from the truth. Um, the real problem here is, in other words, no longer technological or economic. Again, this is the cheapest power on Earth. An Oxford University study from 3 weeks ago made it clear that a rapid transition off fossil fuel and onto renewable energy would be by far the most economic approach here. And by far the most economic means, in this case, saving tens of trillions of dollars compared to even a slow transition off fossil fuel. Never mind the existential the existential advantages of having a planet to live on. Um, 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 the problem here is vested interest. The only people who don't want to shift rapidly, the only players who don't want to shift rapidly are those people who own coal mines and oil wells, and the long chain of politicians and others who have been all too willing to take their money and do their bidding for far too long. And that list obviously includes lots of people in the media business. One of the most interesting pieces of work in the last year or so that people have done, and you were mentioned that piece I did for the New Yorker about a year ago, but others have done great work on this too, is coming to understand the degree to which the PR industry and the media industry in general are deeply hooked into this fossil fuel world. Um, um, just as with many other disgraceful episodes in human history, it turns out that there have been lots of people in the public relations and media industry who've been happy to take money to do things that they either realized or should have realized were harming, not helping progress going forward. And so we see just endless examples of this kind of greenwashing underway. The ones I wrote about in the New Yorker that I used as the focus for that piece were, one of our most prominent public relations firms employing people of enormous talent to do ads for Exxon, in which they demonstrated with all kind of clever devices the notion that Exxon was learning to or working on using algae to power our future going forward. And in fact, they did so many of these ads and commercials that you'd be forgiven for thinking that Exxon was essentially an algae company that happened to have a few oil wells on the side. But as it turns out, it's all silliness. They're going to, Exxon, if it even continues down this path, will be generating something like 0.5% of its work, even 5 or 10 years down the road, will have anything to do with this. And instead, they'll be continuing to build out and explore for more hydrocarbons on a massive scale, undermining every attempt to deal with the crisis that we face. So it really is, at this moment, time for people who are serious about public relations to stand up for the public. And it's time for journalists to really be much, much, much tougher on taking on this industry, which is at the heart of the problem that we face. There have been a few wonderful examples of media institutions that have done that. Enormous respect, for instance, to Alan Rusbridger, probably the greatest editor in the UK in a very long time, for in his stint at The Guardian, uh, took on an old-fashioned newspaper crusade of the kind we haven't seen for decades when he got The Guardian fully behind the campaign to divest institutions from their investments in fossil fuel, which has become probably the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at about $15 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested. And The Guardian was no small part of that, and was one of the reasons why more than half the colleges and the universities in the UK have divested at this point. Not everybody's going to be willing to do crusading work like that, but we need lots of people willing to be braver than they've been so far in, if nothing else, pointing out that the fossil fuel emperor at this point is mostly naked and causing an extraordinary amount of trouble. That's the bottom line. The International Energy Agency, which is the quite conservative operations set up in the 1970s by the Western countries alarmed by OPEC to try and ensure their fossil fuel future. Even the International Energy Agency said earlier this year that we can no longer have any expansion of the fossil fuel industry. And yet the biggest banks in the world continue to toss trillions of dollars at this industry. The biggest politicians continue to slow walk change. And our most important media enterprises haven't figured out, are either participating in this charade, or they haven't figured out in the deepest ways how to get underneath it and really expose it for the blatant greenwashing. Really, greenwashing is almost too kind a word, the kind of sabotage of the future that it represents. So that's where we are. And I'll just end where I began. This is the first real timed test that we've faced as a civilization. We don't get to come back in a decade and have another conference about this. And what I mean, if we don't get it right in the next few years, and we don't get it right, and we go past irrevocable tipping points, no one has a plan for refreezing the Arctic once it's melted, and a planet with a melted Arctic isn't going to work. And there's 15 other, cases like that around the world, all of which are in violent and chaotic flux right now. So think differently about this than you think about anything else that you deal with, because trust me, your kids, your grandkids, and whatever history is around to assess it will think very differently about this than about anything else we're dealing with now.
That brilliant. For that brilliant summary of where we are and how fast we now need to change. We have only a couple of minutes for questions left, and I'll maybe start us off with one. You mentioned that we have been very bad at showing climate change and talking about climate change in media, and we've gone a little bit better recently, but we're still not giving it the volume it deserves. There's been some interesting research here in the UK by a body called Albert, looking at how often climate change gets mentioned in non-news media, so in entertainment programs and scripted programs. And it gets mentioned a lot less than the activities that cause climate change, flying, eating meat. And actually, most worryingly, they looked at how often, they looked at 100 random samples of a mention of eating meat or flying, and they looked at whether the high carbon price tag of that activity was mentioned, and they found it wasn't. What do you think media needs to do now to start linking those activities and those behaviors with the cost that will have on our future? And how would you write that into those storylines in a non-news context?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting question around this sort of set of individual behaviors, flying and eating meat and things. All of which are worth thinking about. But truthfully, this is one of the places where the media, I think, has gotten this wrong, more wrong than right over the years. It's focused too much on particular individual activities. We're way past the point where we're going to solve the climate crisis one Tesla at a time, guys. one vegan dinner at a time. The most important thing individuals can do is be less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to change the basic political and economic ground rules. And so I'd be way more interested in having, in having media take on the questions of why big banks are, Barclays is going to lend 100 billion or whatever they're going to do this year to the fossil fuel industry, because that's where the deep damage is getting done. And I do think at this point we may have reached the point where a focus on individual action in a weird way serves to kind of take the powers that be off the hook for their far more egregious contributions here.
Any other questions for Bill from the room? Rosie?
Hi, Rosie Tower from the Responsible Media Forum. Bill, it's a personal question, actually. I wondered whether there's any books or shows or films that you attribute your own passion for the environment to, maybe from your youth that kind of sparked this.
The truth is, Rosie, when I was in my youth, which was a very long time ago, there were no books about this stuff anyway, and that's why I started writing them. I did grow up and continue to be in have a religious impulse, and when I was a boy, the great children's books of C.S. Lewis were very important to me in forming my kind of moral outlook about the world. And I've stayed annoyed at mendacity ever since. And so I've been, was really grateful to the chance to read the Narnia books when I was a kid. So if I was thinking back on my youth, that would be really important. The good news is that there's now an enormous literature for people to draw on of great power. And I would highly recommend, if you haven't gotten to read it yet, Richard Power's wonderful novel from a year ago, The Overstory. And I would highly recommend Kim Stanley Robinson's body of work, but his recent Ministry for the Future. These are really, really terrific pieces of work that help stretch the imagination in important new ways and help people understand why movements and activists are such an important part of all of this. There's a tendency of journalists always to look down on activists and think they're kind of silly and get in the way, and it's easy to make fun of Extinction Rebellion or whatever it is. But in fact, these are the people who do the most important work of actually shifting the zeitgeist around us, of changing our sense over time of what's normal and natural and obvious. So I'm always deeply grateful to activists and the people who chronicle them.
Thank you very much for that, Bill. We'll take one final question from the lady in the back before we move. Just a brief answer to this one, please, if possible.
Sorry, I'll make it quick. Thank you. I'm Rachel from Sky. I just wondered, in your opinions, talking about activists, and here in the UK, there's been quite a lot of activity over the last few weeks with Insulate Britain blocking major motorways in the UK, and I just wondered on your perspective about the responsibility of media to cover those activist events. I think I've noticed a significant shift in the last few days that the kind of media attention is focusing on these, awful, tragic stories of people being held up by the activists rather than about the kind of, the point of why they're kind of there in the first place. So yeah, I just was interested in your perspectives on how media covers activists.
As someone who does activism, it is no question that it's incumbent on activists to factor into their planning how media are going to react, and make sure that things that they're doing, are going to read well, play well in the media, and so it's important for activists to study media and its weaknesses and limitations and places that it's so coming up with stories that are actually going to help, not hurt, is an important part of activism. But the point I was trying to make earlier is the far more important point is for media to understand the actual stakes at work here, and be willing to put things in context in powerful ways, so that people really get why it is that there are human beings who are willing to take risk upon themselves, so on and so forth, to make change happen. It's not because anybody wants to spend their life doing any of this. Every time I end up heading off to jail, I'm struck again by how absurd it is that people have to go to jail in order to get the powers that be in our society to take seriously the unanimous warning of scientists to do something about it. But that activism is important everywhere, including within the media. And I'll just say I've been very moved to watch the work of this new group, Clean Creatives, that's working to press the PR industry. And in the UK, the work of, in particular along the media industry, the work of leaders like Solitaire Townsend, to try and rally people around the industry to do the right thing. And as we go to other and more useful speakers here, and I'm really looking forward to Genevieve in particular, let me just say that for people within the media industry, people of enormous creative talent, the idea that people are willingly putting that talent to work for the people who are threatening in the deepest ways the future of our planet and of the most vulnerable people on it is a great shame. So if you have friends or colleagues who are at work in this way, do your best to ease them out of it. Friends don't let friends work for Exxon. That's the bottom line here.
To end on, Bill, thank you very much.